Hello, everyone, and welcome to day two of ESI Digital Winter. For those of you who checked in yesterday, you would have experienced a jam-packed day of content, and I hope and pray networking too. We also inducted the latest three members of the ESI Hall of Fame. So those were Naz from Riot Games, Anna from DreamHack, and Mike Sepso, who has been involved in esports for far too long and is now CEO of a company called Vindex. So another congratulations to them and a big thank you to Singtel and to Game in Malta for partnering with us. We've got another Fun Packs Day today, which includes this panel, of course, which I shall introduce in a moment. But later on, we also have the fourth edition of The Clutch. The Clutch is our pitch investment competition, which sees four esports related startups at different stages in their journeys, pitching live to both the audience and to the judges as well. And we'll also be announcing the winner of that at the end of the day. So we've got about 8 hours of live content and networking for you all today. So let's get started, shall we? Spike, Grant, Christian, thanks for joining us. How are you guys doing?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sam.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. We'll get straight to actually an important question first of all, because we were talking about it on the ESI Discord earlier. Did anyone manage to get a PS5? Let's talk about
that. I did manage to get a PlayStation 5, but I rerouted it to my younger brother, who has just opened it, and I had to quickly take a call between him and my mother, trying to figure out the difference between an HDMI cable and a power cable and plug it in. So I've done a bit of technical support this morning as well. So I'm feeling good. I'm ready to go.
So you're right, mate. So you're right. All right, nice one. So PS5 talk is done. Spike, as you started, you may be the first to introduce yourself. So we'll go around the room and everyone can introduce themselves, their backgrounds, and their companies to get us started.
Great. Hello, everybody. I'm Spike Laurie. I've had the pleasure of working in esports for a little while with a few different hats on. Currently, I split my time between being a venture director at Hero Capital, or a €100 million Series A and B venture capital fund founded by Ian Livingston. And the rest of my time I spend with my West Coast friends on a sort of startup called Prize Payments, where we are handling prize money fulfillment for esports organizers and game publishers globally.
Thank you, Spike. And Christian, over to you, sir.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. So Christian Christoph, I'm a vice president with Deloitte's investment banking group. And essentially where we focus on is advising companies when they get to the point that either they're looking to sell to a bigger strategic, they're looking to bring on a capital partner, and we are essentially helping them walk through that process from the advisory side. And in terms of esports in particular, I've been focused on this space for the past few years now, more particularly kind of looking more broadly at kind of the investment activity that's going on and trying to develop some trends there, and as well as working with some companies in the space as they try to find capital partners.
Thank you, Christian. And Grant, over to you. Oh, Grant, can you hear us?
Our first casualty.
Yeah. There's always, I thought it'd be you, Spike. I don't know why. I thought it'd be you. All right, well, hopefully Grant can...
I was hoping it was going to be me. But...
Yeah, I wasn't, I promise. I'm sure Grant will rejoin us soon enough, and we can get his introduction then. But we'll get started in that case. So it's almost the end of the year, almost Christmas, or indeed almost Thanksgiving for our US friends. But going back to January 2020, let's talk through what some of your predictions were for the esports investment landscape at the start of this year. What was the state of it back in January through to now? Have there been any, I guess, unexpected occurrences or indeed unexpected growth sectors? Obviously, as we all know, esports has been in the mainstream limelight a lot more. So, but what has that actually led to in terms of investment? But yeah, going back to January 2020, Christian, I suppose you're probably best placed at Deloitte to give us something of an overview of what you guys were looking at and how you were assessing the esports landscape at the start of this year?
Yeah, certainly. So I'd say to start, the expectation was going to be continued strong growth and investment. Looking at from 2018 to 2019, from our perspective and looking at investment, there was an increase of about 25% in investment activity from 18 to 19. And we were certainly expecting that to continue going into 2020. And kind of breaking down that 25% growth, our expectation was that we were going to see continued investment from private equity groups. So certainly, as you look at the esports landscape, I'd say it's still largely dominated on the VC side, just given the size of companies and the maturation of the space at this point. But certainly over the past few years, we've started to see continued interest from traditional private equity groups, and these are groups, growth equity, traditional private equity, that are looking at businesses that are a little bit further along. So having some demonstrated profitability, some demonstrated scale, kind of a built-in management team, essentially getting past some of the growing pains that you might see as you're growing a smaller size company. So expectation was we'd see continued growth from those types of parties, and that the types of investment would continue kind of across the board on the esports space. And so I'd say kind of looking at how 2020 has gone, certainly the COVID impact had a significant toll on investment activity. I'd say probably through February and April, from February to April, we saw a decline month over month, and comparing it year over year as well, in terms of the amount of activity. And I think a large part of that is probably due to obviously the quarantine measures and the inability to have face-to-face meetings, and more broadly, I think just more of a broader risk assessment from the investment side of not knowing exactly where things are going on a broader economic scale. So we saw some slowdown there, but it pretty quickly ramped back up over the months following that, in terms of activity. So it's something we're still monitoring in terms of getting down to a final number for 2020 and how that compares to 2019. But certainly look to kind of right size through the middle of the year as you continue to see activity. And obviously with cases increasing all over the place, it might be something where there might be some pause again in terms of investment activity and how some of these groups are making their considerations. So that'll be something to monitor. But overall, it's certainly been in some ways a positive, in the sense that, as you mentioned, it's created opportunities for people that are active investors and interested investors in finding new things, but being able to get broader exposure to the esports space because they're seeing all of this news activity and increased activity in terms of people playing games through COVID and things like that. So I think that's been positive, and certainly, and we can get into it later in terms of the types of conversations we've had with some of these new entry participants in terms of investors that realize this is a space that we need to get involved in, and we need to find a way how to make this work. And we've had a significant increase in those types of conversations, I'd say, kind of this year than I was expecting.
When did you? I'll chuck it over to you shortly, Spike, I promise. But Christian, when did you guys actually start looking into the esports space at Deloitte from an investment point of view, at least?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably when I started. One of the first things, it was a space I've always been interested in. And so coming on board with Deloitte, it was one where it felt like it was getting on the cusp of where the types of clients we have and the types of investment activity that we focus on, that it was going to start to make sense for us. So it's probably at that point that we started getting involved in and started internally from our end trying to get a better sense of who's investing in what are the subsectors, and in those types of questions we were trying to get answered internally, and kind of have built on that over the past few years.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn, right? And it's definitely a difficult industry to unpack the various subsets, especially when there's not quite so much information available as there could be. And so, Spike, the same question. So back in January through to now, I guess, how have things changed with Hero's focus on the market? What have you noticed, identified, explored, and so on?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting time, or an unprecedented time. If anyone's opened an email in the last 6 months, they've read that in the title. But one of the things to be aware of is, we as esports insiders, if I may use that term, we understand that the fabric and the framework of esports is really this sort of connective tissue of gamers and tournaments and leagues and cups, and that is what builds esports. But to the outsiders, it's these big, beautiful tentpole pictures of IEM Katowice or Blast events or League of Legends finals. And really, it's the live events business which, to the non-endemics, has what's really attracted them, I think, lately to the esports space. Seeing those really beautiful pictures, seeing these people coming together and saying we want to be part of that. But it's the live events industry that's been the most hit because of the pandemic. And so what we've seen a lot of businesses having to pivot, having to change the way they're operating, almost going back to the old school way of doing things, of looking at grassroots, looking at the framework of esports and player desire to compete against other people, and dial that up while sort of keeping their pro tournaments going along in the hope that in the future they'll be able to go back to live events. But so if you're an outsider, it's very, again, hard to work out what's going on. Esports on one side is having this huge boom. The games industry is having this huge boom. Yet on the same time, the tournament organizers, the people that have been putting on these live events, it's not easy for them. It's difficult. It's pretty hard for them, and they're having to pivot. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is for startups, it has been a bit of a difficult time in general because there are no networking events. There's no opportunity to talk to someone about what you're working on, or from a business development perspective, it's very different. You have to rely on existing networks. Decision makers are a little bit more reticent to make decisions around their business in the uncertainty of the pandemic. And so you've got a lot of startups who have a huge amount of promise, but can't activate that promise without that business development muscle, without those networking events, without those esports events, without the opportunity to speak to the decision makers face to face. Again, they're finding it a little bit more difficult to sort of get the trajectory they need to lift off.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we hadn't hosted a digital event before this year, right? And like one of the inductees I mentioned from yesterday, Anna, the COO at DreamHack, I can't imagine like pivoting ESI's conferences this year was tricky enough. I cannot imagine what that was like over in Stockholm for the DreamHack team. Anyway, thank you for that, Spike. Grant, welcome back. How you doing?
My background has changed. I've moved right beside my router. Actually, just to Spike's point, this is one of the problems everybody's facing. Virtual is a challenge sometimes, obviously, and home office connectivity clearly isn't up to the same level as a commercial, and nothing really replaces that face-to-face opportunity. So while I have it, I'll give you the quick background on myself, and then I'll jump back in on that topic. I'm the CEO of Esports Entertainment Group. I was involved in the online gaming business from 95 to 99. I came back in after Alex Lim and Ken Silva introduced me to a StarCraft championship in 2014. And when I
it's touch and go. Christian, you're still here, aren't you?
Yeah.
I think we lost Sam and Grant. We're 2 down.
It looks like it. Yeah. Uh-oh.
Wow. Grant, we lost you just as you were getting into the swing of things.
Right. I'm going to be glitchy. I'm like an old video game, pixelated and glitchy. So in 2014, I saw the StarCraft. I said, I've got to be involved in this business. I need to be in the energy level, the excitement. Sam, I met you not long after that. You and Ollie over in where was that? It was at Amsterdam, I believe. And from that moment to this one, it's been a tremendously bizarre journey. We finally got through our IPO to the NASDAQ, and in keeping with the bizarrety that is 2020, on our roadshow, COVID launched itself upon the planet right when the Russians and the Saudi Arabians were having an oil spat and the capital markets fell apart. That was during our roadshow. So I was West Coast USA when they were talking about closing the borders with Canada. And we had to finish and reprice the O because what happened in the capital markets. So we'll talk more about that when we get to the financial part of the esport business. And then we achieved our objective, and from that point to this point, we've been executing on the business plan and doing quite a bit of acquisitions. I would have been proud to show you the logos that are normally behind me on my green screen, but instead you're seeing some needlepoint. that's
great needlepoint, by the way.
Yes, I spent all weekend doing it.
You're multi-talented there, Grant. Yeah, good.
Nice.
Grant, it's not just you, mate. I got disconnected as well. It's the wonders of working from home, right? Absolute wonders of it. Did I miss your introduction? I know you, to be fair, so I could probably do it myself, but we've gone through that, I assume.
Yes, many times.
Indeed. We'll jump back into it then. Apologies about that, guys. So the next question was more about patterns in esports investment and indeed the various challenges and opportunities region to region. We've all said, right, that the investment landscape has been hit by COVID and such this year for sure, but have some regions been more affected than others? And indeed, which regions are each of you most focused on for your respective businesses? So Spike, your box is next to mine, mate, so I'll chuck it over to you first.
Yeah, I think there's a scale when people talk about esports investments. It depends on the focus of the investor. So obviously there are different types of investors out there. I come from I'm in a venture capital fund, a traditional venture capital fund, which means I'm always going to approach an esports investment or games investment with that lens and that hat on. And a venture capitalist's goal is to get into a company relatively early, give them capital to grow, give them experience and network and help building that out and growing. But ultimately, I report to, or I'm beholden to, a series of LPs and investors who are expecting a return on their money in an 8-year time window. Private equity has a different approach. Family office has a different approach. A high net worth individual has a different approach. And that means, for an esports business, well, the first things that I would say is, not all investors are the same. Different investors have different lenses that they're looking at the market and what they're trying to do. And the second thing I would say is there's also another gradient of sort of esports has become a much more nebulous term over the last 5 years. Certainly since, when I've been at ESL and then getting in the investment space, people use esports in a much more laissez-faire way than perhaps they did 6, 7, 8 years ago. And it's now, and again, we're looking at, if you look at investment funds or venture capital funds who started off in esports, you can see very quickly that they start to move out of the space into games, and more traditional games funds are now also looking at esports investments. So there's a blurring of the line. The definition of esports that I particularly like at the moment and subscribe to is the natural evolution of multiplayer gaming. So on the one side, that might be a team or a league investment, which in my opinion isn't right for a venture capitalist, but is perfect for a high net worth individual who wants to be in a sexy, fun part of the business, wants to make money, but doesn't need to quantify that. That is sort of one extreme. The other extreme, all the way over here, is someone like a game studio or a game publisher or a game technology company that's trying to make a technology or a game that the ecosystem benefits from. So really, there's two axes to look at to that question, Sam, if I might. I've gone into detail, I apologize. When you talk about investment, you need to really you've got to think about what investment means, depending on who is the investor. And in terms of the opportunities in esports, again, you need to look at the different sides of the axis. And again, different types of businesses in that spectrum will appeal to different types of investors. And Grant will keep me honest there if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, I'm sure you will. I mean, exactly your point there, though. I think it's the definition of esports, right? People continue to have different definitions of it, and so what really is investing into esports. But Christian, I guess from your side in that regard, like which regions have been most of interest, or do you guys focus most on? I would presume NA, but in terms of your clients, partners, and such that you advise and speak to on a daily basis, I guess on the one hand, which regions do you see the most opportunity? The same question, and also with a nod to Spike's point there, how has the understanding of what esports is and what the opportunities investment wise in esports are progressed, I guess, through this year with your conversations with different clients?
Yeah, certainly. So I'd say to start, I think you're right. In being in an advisory role, our focus is going to be where our clients are, and given our position in North America, it's generally going to be a North American focus. With that said, with Deloitte being a global firm, we've definitely seen opportunities in Europe and Asia as well. I'd say it's a lesser extent of what we focus on, but as those opportunities arise, it's things where we can connect with my colleagues similarly positioned in Asia or Europe or things like that to kind of work through those opportunities. But I'd say certainly more largely focused on North America in terms of looking at trends and looking at different subsectors and where the opportunities are. And to follow on that, in terms of the conversations we've been having with the types of investors we talk to, it's certainly been kind of a growth in those conversations from certainly as Spike mentioned in terms of I think a lot of times as people get their first interest into the space from an investment perspective, they're looking at it from the team side and seeing kind of the glitz and glamour of that. And as they get a deeper understanding of the space, then it's getting a better understanding of some of these other subsectors and what really is the esports space. And I think for a lot of the groups that we talk to, the space is really defined by its demographics, which are much different, I think, than a lot of the other areas where they're investing. And it gives them exposure to an audience that allows them, one, to diversify their portfolio, but it allows them to get access to kind of new groups and possible ways to kind of cross or mesh their different platforms and things like that. And by that, I mean, just given the kind of younger audience that it's skewed, the loyalty of the audience base to the different brands and things that are going on in esports, and just how they consume media is a little bit different, I think, than prior generations. And so that's something that, as they look at the space, I think that's the driving factor in a lot of ways. And so then that dictates what they look towards when they're looking at different investment opportunities and looking at different subsectors. And I think how that translated at this point from conversations we've had is a lot more focus on the infrastructure side of the industry. And that's things like different support platforms and tools and different opportunities that are more focused on the demographic space without necessarily being specifically tied to a particular game or a particular team, but more broadly, the different tools and things that support the space. Those are opportunities, I'd say, that as those come across, when we present them to different investors, that they're going to be most interested in.
For sure, makes sense. And Grant, I might have missed this in my brief hiatus when I dropped out of the panel for a few minutes. But if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, esports entertainment groups' areas of focus. Obviously, you guys have grown and pivoted a lot this year. And are there particular regions that you guys are focused on, and where do you see those opportunities? I know you're based in the US, for example, but you've got the tallest man in esports, Magnus, based in Stockholm, right? So you're already pretty international. But which regions are you focused on, and I guess why would be my question here.
Well, yeah, as you know, being the Nasdaq listed esports gaming gambling company, the only one actually. Our focus is more on regulated markets. Certainly, most of the investors we speak with are based in North America, specifically the US. So a lot of the interest from the family offices, high net worth individuals, our market cap isn't at the level yet that the larger funds, we're not having some of those conversations spike. So it's mostly, the groups that play in the 100 million, under the 100 million market cap, which have different parameters, of course. So their interest is mostly, what are we doing in the US? Which, our growth strategy in the U.S. For gambling is to get listed, get up and operational in New Jersey with our buy platform, so that it gives something tactile that they can see. We get the office open work. But the way we can move more quickly is with EGL, which is a UK-based firm, of course, that we acquired. And they still have most of their operations are in the European market. But we've been connect the large sports franchises here in North America, Kings, Galaxy, Philly Union, etc. And that feeds the excitement, the brands that the American investors are more familiar with. I think the opportunity a couple weeks ago was more Asian centric, and it just did not move the needle because we're listed on NASDAQ. So sometimes there's a disconnect, between where you're listed, where your investors are, potential, the gray market, where the bigger profits are. But if, like us, if you have to skew your accordingly, you've got to, as play, so the investors. I'm freezing up again.
That's all right. I could still understand you just about, man. That's fine.
Oh, yeah. So the presentations we overwhelmingly focused on the U.S. market, and we do have probably currently today the bigger part of our business is still in the European markets, in the UK, sure. Malta. With the acquisition that we've just announced that we're working towards acquiring GG Circuit and Helix, which are both US based. That'll shift it to more of a balanced, about 50 people in the US, 50 people in Europe. And that acquisition is 100% eSport focused. The physical locations, which to Spike's point earlier, they are suffering under COVID, of course. But to Christian's point, a lot of investors are interested or focused on infrastructure, like owning your tech, owning the infrastructure. So GG Circuit, the GG Circuit and the Flip acquisition were specifically done with mind that I think it's important at our level that you need to control your tech. And I think the investors are telling us that's what they want to see that as well.
So, sure. I mean, I think that has been a big focus for a lot of VC groups, right? And most that we speak to and I speak to, it's the tech suppliers and the service providers, which are arguably the key area that's of interest. And I guess pretty far from that leads me on to my next question, which is the current state of team investments. So this is one that I guess more so last year, there was a lot of big money being thrown around, right, into the team IPs. I don't quite know what investor appetite generally is for esports teams now, but I guess that would be one that I'd love to hear some opinions on. Like, are teams generally overpriced, underpriced? There's a lot of volatility there, and how do you assess the value of a team? Obviously, the Guild case recently made a lot of noise and was big news with Mr. David Beckham involved, right? But outside of just the Guild example, I guess my question here specifically would be, if each of you had to invest in an esports team, you can't put the money anywhere else, I'm afraid, the money I'm giving you now, what would you look for and how would you value a team? How would you make that assessment before entering into it? I guess, Spike, I'll throw that one to you for starters.
I would probably, I just realized I look like a Bond villain. It's so dark here. I apologize. Look, I think teams are a great space. I think they're in one of the prime positions to soak up a lot of the value of the esports industry, from the game publishers, from the tournament organizers who are now paying teams to play in their leagues, from the sponsors who, these big brands that want to sponsor the space but don't know where to place a bet. Teams are a great place to go. And from the consumer. I think they're really well positioned to do that. And if I was a high net worth individual, it would be one of the first places that I would be right now, and would have done over the last couple of years. I think anyone who knows me pretty well knows I've been interested in this for a few years. What I would invest, however, one thing to say is that if you were given the opportunity to buy Manchester United 60 years ago, 50 years ago, at 10 times market value, at the time you would think it was a terrible deal because it's so overpriced. Today, you look back and say it was a no-brainer. So I think with the team, it's really hard to price the teams. What I do know, if I was looking at investing in a team today, I would find a team that had a great track record, was performing well, but was not commercially savvy at that point. I.e., a lot of the teams are trying to find their raison d'etre. They're trying to justify their valuations. And some are going down the lifestyle route, trying to create merchandise and limited edition drops and be the next Supreme or the next they're trying to build this lifestyle brand. And other teams are going down the licensing route. They're trying to build up rosters of multiple teams. They're trying to license out their intellectual property to emerging markets. And you have a third branch of teams who are trying to be an entertainment kind of platform, who are hiring on influencers and talent and celebrities to try and drive their value. Now, none of these have been proven. And in some respects, I think their attempts at justifying and chasing the valuations that they've been given. Because if you just look at it from an esports team perspective, and revenue are media, sponsorship, and prize money, it doesn't. The valuations that we're seeing, it doesn't kind of make sense today. So to answer your question, I'd find a team that performed very well, were not commercially savvy, hadn't sort of started on a journey of lifestyle or entertainment or agency or any of those paths, and was looking to that would be the right time to get in at a team.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It's a very good answer. I guess Christian and Grant, from a more US focused perspective on this, because I made notes, guys. I was reading just yesterday actually about how the average, and I'm pretty sure this report was accurate, but don't quote me on it, how the average value of an MLS team in 2008 was around the 37 to 40 mark, million USD this is, whereas today, it was 2019 at least, the average value of an MLS team is 300 million USD, with obviously the top ones being worth considerably more than that. And this report was suggesting that is despite the vast majority of them actually making that much money yet, which is what made me think of it in the same way as esports orgs. Despite it being obviously the MLS is still a lot earlier in its journey than the vast majority of top tier leagues worldwide, right? But I guess, Christian, for you, again, in your conversations with clients and partners and such, are teams something that you're asked about a lot, or how often?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It definitely echo what Spike said. In terms of the investors I've been talking to, it's something where it's almost the non-starter at the beginning of the conversation that we're interested in everything in esports but the teams. And I think it goes to what their calculation is when they're looking at investments, and in terms of the amount of risk that they're willing to take on, where a business is at that point, and just what the business model of whatever they're looking at investing is. And I think Spike's right that it's still something where it feels like the teams are trying to figure out what exactly that path to profitability is. And it's something where it seems in some ways they've been painted into a corner with these really high valuation expectations that have come with all these subsequent rounds. And so now it's at a spot where they really need to start demonstrating what that next step path is to profitability. And if it was something where the path to profitability was a 6-month pursuit, then I think it's something that would be interesting for some of the types of investors I talk to. But when it's something where it's a 36 or 48-month path to profitability, that's going to be tougher for them to get interested in. And so certainly when you look at the higher end level of teams, that seems to be kind of where they're at, which makes it difficult for the groups we talk to. The one interesting thing I'd say would be looking at the phase deal that happened earlier this year, as well as the rec deal. Just interesting from the standpoint of alternative debt structures that are coming into the space. And this is something where groups that'll provide some amount of debt with the option to then take some equity at the end of that term is kind of a best of both worlds scenario where if a company is able to support the interest payments for whatever that period of time is, they don't have to give up as much equity. And the interest payments aren't as big as if they were just doing a traditional debt type loan. So as those deals start to progress, I think that's an interesting possibility for the teams, because then for those types of investors, the perspective is, are they going to be able to make the payments over the period of the loan? And then am I comfortable with the equity position I'd have at the end? And so it's not as risky of an assessment, I'd say, for somebody that's looking to just go in from an equity side. So seeing those types of deals occur and talking with some of those alternative debt groups, it's definitely something they're interested in. They're aware of the space. They're just trying to find the right opportunities to get involved. So I think that could be an interesting proposition in terms of investment activity that we might see moving forward. But in terms of the traditional equity groups that we've been talking to, it's just tough to find, I'd say, a path there with some of the teams. And that's not to say all of the teams, because I think as you look beyond that maybe top 10 level, some of these mid-tier teams that are more focused on a regional perspective and really focused on profitability, and some of these teams have been profitable for several years now, granted not at the same scale as some of the larger teams, but they've been able to demonstrate a model, I think, that works when they're focused more from a regional perspective, and really tying themselves to a community. I think there's some interesting opportunities there that as you look over the next 12 months, you might see some activity from types of investors that we talk to in that space.
Yeah, interesting. I guess the time that for more traditional investors, I guess the team being tied to city or at least region or such just makes more sense, right? It's like immediately more palatable and they understand it more readily at least. Grant, I would assume the team's team investment is off the table for Esports Investment Group now, I'm guessing. But was that something that you looked into in the earlier days before you proceeded on the path that you guys are on now?
Well, it certainly comes up frequently. We get approached by teams all the time, as you would imagine. We have an arrangement with Dignitas. If sticking to the top here, if I was forced to, I would look to get involved with a team that had a fan base that has shown itself to be a gambling base. And right now, CSGO is kind of the top title.
Yeah.
If I was not the CEO of a company that was a gambling company I was looking at investing, I would either look to franchise situation, probably North America, probably a title that wasn't constantly changing, makes it very confusing. And I know the publishers can't resist that because a lot of the fans like it, but for stability, so I do like a lot of what's happening with Call of Duty in the States. So if I was esport hat, I'd probably be looking CSGO because they have more gamblers. If I was looking more long term, I'd like the franchise system, and I'd probably pick a CSGO title team. And then I would dig in, like Christian and Spike are suggesting, to find who has the best, who's been running it the best. And that obviously is a different skill set. Title's one thing, but managing the team properly, because you can go into any of these leagues and there's a huge differential between how these teams are managed. Also, what's happening, and thankfully it's happening, is the ecosystem is starting to backfill. Getting those university, scholarship programs and getting that feeder system in place. Because really, 4 years ago, there was not much of a feeder system to esport. You had 5 or 6 teams at the very top, and then it was very skinny underneath. And there's still, I don't think there's scouting reports to this day. Actually, this is one of the reasons we went with Genji, because we're going to be able to produce scouting reports next week. So if there's a hot player in Indonesia and there's a CSGO team in the States and they're trying to recruit, they can pull up the scouting reports and see players from all over the planet. Things like tools like that people take for granted in the sports, the traditional sports business, those don't currently exist, but they're going to be necessary to really give the value to those the teams and build that feeder system for the franchises. But
sure. You need the foundations, right? Like you're doing my job for me. This goes directly into the great question. Thank you very much, Grant. So one of the questions from the audience as well was asking about investing in, specifically in the UK, but I'll broaden it a bit, investing into the grassroots and how can we develop that? And I guess what are the opportunities when we say grassroots? What do we mean? What are the opportunities to invest in and develop the grassroots to build the foundation for the FaZe clans and such of the world, as we say? One we talked about briefly on the pre-event call was the case of Vindex, right? So we had Mike Sepso inducted into Hall of Fame yesterday, and what Vindex are doing with the Belong gaming arenas is impressive. And in terms of, I guess, when we say grassroots, it's in terms of broadening the audience to some degree as well, right? And making esports, however we define that, as accessible as we can for the greatest number of people. And that's everything from schools to colleges to universities and venues, like hometown venues as well. Grant, I guess I'll throw it straight back to you and then we'll go around the room. So we've only got a few minutes left. But I guess the grassroots is something that you guys are already looking into with your investment so far.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. It's another reason for this acquisition we're working with. I mean, you're between GG Circuit and Helix, that's as grassroots as it gets. I mean, Helix runs, 5 centers, 2 of the biggest in the US, 10,000 square feet. And GG Circuit is the enterprise software that manages some of the names you've just mentioned, run on GG Circuit, platform, 720 locations. If we take a step, again, do a comparison to traditional sports, there's not a town in the UK that doesn't have a soccer pitch. Yet I bet you there's not 5 esports facilities in the whole country. In the United States, in Canada, where hockey's a religion, in my town, there's 8, maybe 10 arenas. I don't think there's a single esports facility here. So again, you've got to have a healthy pro league system. You've got to have the underlying infrastructure, the feeder system, and we've got a lot of focus on that right now. This transaction is specifically for that purpose to be part of the. If we want a healthy long-term play, we've got to make sure there's a healthy ecosystem involved here. So we do plan to, once COVID's finished and we get this behind us, we do plan to be aggressively putting those facilities, throughout North America and into the European markets as well. We're talking to some people in your backyard now, Sam.
Nice to hear, mate. The UK needs some help, so yeah, please do keep investing. Spike, I'll throw this one over to you. In terms of like Hero Capital's focus on the grassroots, using that term fairly loosely. I know you guys look into, I guess, independent game studios and such, but what do you think the opportunities are for the investment opportunities for grassroots esports on the whole?
Yeah, so I think my particular taste leans more towards the digital space for esports rather than the physical space. A great example, one of Hero's earlier investments, it was EdgeGap, who are a super clever company that have basically created an algorithm or piece of software that when 2 people are matchmaking or more, can do it up to battle royale, whatever. But when a lobby is matchmaking, normally what would happen, Sam, if you and I would both connect to AWS Amsterdam, or it would be hosted on one of our machines, we'd play against each other. So whoever's closest to the data center is going to have an advantage, or whoever's hosting the machine is going to have an advantage. And so what their software does is, in the matchmaking system, probes the network, figures out exactly where you live, where I live, where the other players live, and then springs up in a couple of seconds a dedicated server on the edge of the network, i.e. in a telecommunications center that is equidistant between the players, in giving everyone a ping advantage, and also in some instances as well, if it's keyed for, increasing integrity so that the average, the ping between everyone is more even. So again, for me, that's what I would call esports infrastructure. You can already think of the opportunities there for players to have a better experience with the games that they're playing. But the difference being from from their home computer or wherever they live, rather than at a physical venue. But like I said, it's just taste. But this for example is an example where Hero have invested and are supporting sort of what I would call grassroots infrastructure of esports.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, it makes perfect sense. We've got just about a minute left, I think, so we'll go around the room quickly and we'll stretch it to a minute and a half. What are some of your predictions, bold, conservative or otherwise, for esports investment in 2021? This could be just particular sectors, growth sectors that you think will be very popular amongst investors, in esports next year. But Christian, I'll throw that one to you first.
Yeah, sure. So I'd say likely going to be a continuation in terms of investor interest from what we've seen over the past few years. So focus, at least from the groups we talked to, focus on infrastructure. Presumably, as COVID kind of resolves itself and live events come back, I think that'll be a key area as well. Probably the bigger thing, like I mentioned, is just around the debt side and just the fact that we're seeing more of those types of opportunities. One, I think it points to the continued maturation of the space, the fact that we now have this whole new type of structure of deals that could support companies as they develop. So I think that'll be super interesting and something that will likely continue, because usually once you get a couple of these alternative debt groups in, you'll start to see more and more of them kind of follow suit. So could see that is increased opportunities in 2021 to get deals done in terms of getting capital to people to continue growing esports businesses.
Thank you very much. And Grant, over to you. Elevator pitch.
Well, based on the questions we're having, which are 15 to 20 a day, clearly there's a heightened interest from funds to invest into esports. It is definitely a hot topic. It's an area that funds are going to continue to flow into it. They're starting to get a little more profit focused or ROI focused. A year ago it was like, we got to get something in esports. Here's $50 million. That was a bad plan. And there's a lot of those out there. We've mentioned some on this call. So the investors are definitely starting to the sophisticated are starting to focus more on when is this thing going to go into the black. But as long as you can show a clear path, I think the money will continue to flow in. In our position, what we tell investors is, hey, you can get in on this for $1,000. You don't need to buy a $20 million sports franchise.
Someone's 2 o'clock meeting is coming. I think I'll finish quickly if that's all right, Sam. I think we're going to see more amalgamation. We've seen this year ESL and DreamHack tightening themselves up together. We've seen what Vindex are doing. We've seen what EEG are doing and what Grant's up to. Sort of the amalgamation, the aggregation of these businesses into sort of people tightening up, becoming different businesses, sort of becoming a more cohesive unit in the industry. And I think next year we'll see a lot more of that as people try and defend their positions and start to reap the benefits of 20 hard years of esports labor.
Indeed. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. All right, guys, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you to everyone for listening. Sorry to those whose questions that we didn't quite have time for. Esports investment in 2020 is a fairly wide-ranging topic, which we could probably talk about for hours. But all these guys are easily findable on LinkedIn. Spike, you're on Twitter, aren't you? You can find them very easily, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks everybody.
Sam.